Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Slave Trade. Now, for this particular mini lecture, like others, we're going to talk about 5 things that you should, or 5 terms, that you should know about in order to have a better sense of this topic. And it's important to keep in mind a few things when talking about the slave trade. First, right, there's 2 trades, right? So we're going to be talking for a moment about the international trade, and then the rest of this, we're really going to kind of focus ourselves on aspects of the domestic slave trade, again, in the U.S. All right, so term number 1 would be international slave trade, right? So the enslavement of individuals from Africa, began well far before the starting of the U.S. itself in the late 1770s and the early 1800s. However, the international slave trade to the U.S. Ended effectively January 1st, 1808, at least legally. Right? So, of course, between 1808 and 1865, with the passage of the 13th Amendment and the adoption of the 13th Amendment, enslavement supposedly, of course, ends in the U.S., but that period between 1808 and 1865, the international trading in people, right, was a process that still went on. Of course, the United States was not the only nation that enslaved individuals from Africa. Primarily in the first half of the 19th century, we'd be talking about places like Brazil and Cuba, which of course went on even after the U.S. But again, the international slave trade continued during this time. There's a lot of work that's done by the British to try to bring an end to the international slave trade, but it continued. And in terms of individuals from Africa that are brought to the U.S., enslaved people brought to the U.S. between 1808 and 1865, so after the international trade ended, the thing to kind of think about with that is, of course, that occurs. So the second point would be the domestic slave trade. Again, after 1808 is the focus, but there are individuals still coming in illegally, that are forcibly brought illegally. The third thing for us to kind of keep in mind are businesses and traders. So the sad reality, of course, is that the commodification not only of people with the institution of slavery in the U.S. Extended, quite extensively. So you have a business model that is developed by those who were trading in enslaved people, and that's a process that was quite profitable in America in the first half of the 19th century. So again, slavery's a business, and the individuals who owned that business, developed the business as they attempted to throughout the first half of the 19th century. Now, abolitionists, for the most part, and others, often saw the slave traders themselves as fundamentally, of course, awful individuals. And they became, especially within the American South, in the first half of the 19th century, as sort of these individuals held up within the culture and within the rhetoric as fundamentally bad. So I'm thinking specifically of Harriet Beecher Stowe's, sort of Uncle Tom's Cabin and all of that, where you sort of see, you see slave traders portrayed as these particularly, sort of terrible individuals, which they were, but as a way of trying to sort of say, see, look, we're good, as slave owners, not like these slave traders who are bad. And of course, there's no such thing as a good slave owner. So, the process or the business, concept of slave trading, international, domestic. The fourth thing for us to keep in mind is public market and private sale. Public market and private sale. So particularly the process of sale. So after 1808, you do not necessarily have, at least legally, in terms of slave laws in the U.S., enslaved people arriving, but what you do have, of course, are sales of enslaved people that occurred really throughout the U.S. at this time. So for those who've seen films, right, the Amistad's and 12 Years a Slave and all that, often what we end up seeing portrayed, right, is the public markets that existed. But we should keep in mind that the process whereby an enslaved person would be sold varied widely, right? So this could occur in public, in open sort of environments where slave traders operating on behalf of businesses would sell people, and often, you would have, quite a great deal of sort of the slave owning and trading community kind of come together to make these purchases, often around the seasons as it related to whatever crop it was that they were working with. The public market itself is not the only way. So you're going to also see private sales, both in the businesses of these individuals or from person to person, the purchasing of these individuals. Enslaved people, right, experience that part of the process. Being moved often with the seasons, so planting seasons and harvesting seasons, and the structure in which they're moved was something called coffle. The last thing for us with this would be New Orleans. So again, the process of enslavement. So in the first half of the 19th century, right, you have a lot of you have a lot of demographic mobility in the U.S., and so you have a lot of white slave owners and their families moving southward and westward, and you have enslaved people moving southward and westward with them, being forced to move with them for the creation of these new cotton plantations, places like Alabama and Louisiana and that kind of thing. And in that period, right, New Orleans had already been a colonial center, right, for the Spanish and French, but in the first half of the 19th century, it emerges as a financial center for the planter South. And so coming out of New Orleans, you have a lot of money that is then tied to enslaved people. And so the largest slave markets for trading and the process of being enslaved, right, were in New Orleans in the first half of the 19th century. So understanding the dynamics of New Orleans and those public markets, which were off of Jackson Square, is central for us to understanding how enslaved people experienced that particular period. Thank you very much.